County of Broomfield. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Midway Boulevard Multimodal Plan.
Buenas noches, mi nombre es Sarah Grant, soy gerente de transportes de la ciudad y condado de Broomfield. Gracias por acompañarnos a la reunión de hoy sobre el plan de múltiples modalidades de Midway Boulevard.
For interpretation, please connect using a tablet or computer.
Para escuchar la interpretación, por favor, conectarse usando una tableta o computadora.
And go to the globe icon in the bottom right of your screen.
Vaya al icono del globo en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla.
Select the language of your preference, English or Spanish.
Great. We are going to pause a second. We should all see the, no, it's not showing in mine. We should all see the globe for interpretation. So please select English or Spanish. Select English even if you are looking to listen in English. So wait just a second. And then we'll move on. Okay, hopefully everyone's had time to do that. So I'm Alicia Zimmerman. I'm a consultant with the project team. I'm going to be doing part of this presentation along with Mark Ambrosi from City and County of Broomfield. And I'm going to go give you a little orientation to how we're going to conduct this meeting before we get into the technical content. Our rules of engagement today, thank you for those of you who have joined us here. Initially, we're going to use the Q&A box. So I'll give a little picture of what that looks like in a second, but look for Q&A on the bottom bar. If you have any questions, you're able to do that at any point in the presentation. And we have Q&A sessions where we will start to answer those at the end of each topic. But the main rules of engagement for this meeting are just to be polite and be respectful, respect all your neighbors, the other meeting participants, as well as the project team. Don't use profanities or inappropriate language. The other thing you'll notice, if you see Liz Maria here on the screen, she's doing live interpretation, and I'm notorious for talking way too fast. So your presenters will be trying to speak more slowly, make it easier for more people to understand, and also take pauses so that we can all get caught up. Orientation to the Zoom platform. We've been in this for a year and a half now, almost, amazingly. So hopefully most of you are familiar with Zoom. I'm going to go through it because we always have newcomers, so great to get into it. First off, this meeting is being recorded so that we can put it on the website and other folks can watch it if they weren't able to attend. Because this is a webinar format, you all are muted by default. So if you're looking madly to how to unmute yourself, that's not possible unless later in the meeting it makes sense to selectively unmute people to ask specific questions. I'm also looking to see, I don't yet see anybody as a call-in. If we have call-ins, we have kind of a different process for that. So as I mentioned, the Q&A, question and answer box is your opportunity to ask questions at any point in the presentation. If it's an obvious question that there's a problem with the presentation or something, we'll stop at that point. But if not, we'll probably wait until a Q&A break so that we can make sure to get through our content. Our main goals here are to hear from you all and to get information to you all. So we've got a lot to do today, and I want to make sure we're efficient if possible. And there's also a chat box, and you can see the Q&A button here is highlighted. That's the one to use mainly. We will use chat during the polling sessions, but don't use chat until I tell you that it's time. And as you note here, there are also polling sessions 3 throughout the presentation. And that's one of the ways we will get input from you all. Again, a reminder just to be respectful to everybody, even in your question submittal and if and when you use the chat. A note that after the meeting, additional information, meeting recording, that type of thing will be posted to broomfieldvoice.com/Midway plan. So feel free to keep an eye on that. Hopefully you're already doing that. Always has updated information weekly. And the phone number to call in for the hotline is 303-464-5827. So keep those in mind as we move through. We're going to get to practice here right off the bat, polling session and a Q&A session. So polling session 1, the instructions for these polling sessions are that a new polling window will pop up, not yet, I'll tell you in a second when it's supposed to. It'll pop up on your screen and follow the instructions on the screen, which basically is just select one answer or multiple answers, depending on the question. We will close the poll after about 1 minute, just depending on how fast people are participating. And then I will then share the results after the poll closes. So let's do our first practice round here, if I can get this started. Okay. So the poll has been launched. Somebody from the project team, please raise your hand if you're not seeing the poll. And I see people are answering, so it looks like it's working. A few more of you here. Okay, we'll wait another about 10 seconds. So while you're waiting, what best describes your interest in the corridor? We're just trying to find out who you are. That's our first question is, I guess, not who you are, but how you're connected to Midway. So we want to make sure that this presentation is specialized to answer questions that, that address the participants who are involved tonight. So, all right, another 5 seconds. We'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're going to end this one. And I'm going to share the results here. So everybody should see the results on your screen. And basically, the majority of you live on the corridor, which is great. And I know you were allowed to select more than one. So a few live close to the corridor, but not immediately. And then some within Broomfield, and then some in businesses on the corridor. So it looks like you all are all pretty familiar and tied to the corridor. So thank you for participating in that one. That one's a little bit of an easy one. We'll get into some of the more technical and input-oriented ones later on. And our first Q&A session is here just to remind you how to provide input. Here's the Q&A button you'll see on the bottom of your screen, and you can click on that and type your question if you have a comment or a question. And we don't have anybody on the phone, but just in case I'm not seeing them, if you are on the phone, press *9 and you'll effectively raise your hand. And we can come unmute you as time permits. So seeing as I don't see any immediate questions posted, which is expected, we can keep moving here. Quick presentation overview before I hand it over to Mark in a few slides here. Our main goals here, as I mentioned, are to get input from you all and to explain the project. This is the first kind of public touch point we've had on this specific project. The project team has been gathering existing conditions and thinking about toolbox ideas, but not really trying to apply them. So we're going to go through project background, how we got where we are on the Midway Corridor multimodal plan, talk through those existing conditions, and there will be a polling and Q&A on that. And then talk through the toolbox and ideas we have, just kind of presenting a world of ideas, not certainly the specific answers, but and I do see a question here, a very good question. We have 3 workshops scheduled with the same outline. Each of the workshops will have the same content. Of course, different people participating may mean different questions and different discussions. But thank you, Lynette, for your question about all 3 workshops are at least set up to be the same, with just you all making them different if they are. And you'll also see with the timing on this, I intend, especially we have a little bit smaller group right now, so hopefully that means we can move through this pretty quickly with Q&A and things like that, and we can get you out of here a little bit early. Our goal is for sure by 8:30, but aiming it a little bit before that. And one last piece before we get into the meat, or veggie burger, or whatever your preference. For reference, we've been throwing around some of these common, terms that I'm in the industry, so I think of them as common. And sometimes my husband has to stop and say, hold on, that's not a word normal people use. So we're going to go through a few of those before we get into the main presentation. The first is in the project name. We're called Midway Boulevard Multimodal Action Plan. Multimodal just means multiple modes of travel. The transportation vision for Broomfield means that we're really looking at moving people, not just cars, and we're measuring it kind of by how many options we provide people for transportation and whether we can get people where they need to go the way they're able or interested in going. So mode of travel might mean, you're in a car. It might mean even freight on some parts of this corridor. It might mean you're riding a bicycle or a scooter or in a wheelchair or walking. So all of those and others are considered a mode of travel. So we're looking at this from a multimodal perspective. This picture shows a road, not exactly Midway, but kind of close, that shows all or at least many of the modes we will consider. And the second of 3 terminology slides talks about from what we call the back of curb. So if you think of the curb, between the curb and businesses or houses or buildings, in the public right of way, we often have a sidewalk. You're familiar with that term. If you look at this, what looks like kind of like a yellow brick road here, that's kind of a traditional sidewalk. It's set back from the roadway. And it's, currently some places it's a little narrower. That's kind of what we think of as a sidewalk. If you look at the orange stripe through here, if we had a sidewalk right there instead of the vegetation, that would be called an attached sidewalk because it's attached to the roadway. So we'll talk a little bit about those. And then multi-use path could be in either the orange or yellow locations and is usually a little bit wider and includes people who are basically on any wheeled vehicle and those who are walking, running, that type of thing. So it adds typically those on bicycle into the pedestrian realm and increases the pathway. So that's a multi-use path. The last one here, you'll look at the yellow areas that are highlighted for most of these. A pedestrian refuge is a usually raised space in the middle of a road, like the number 2 over here, where a pedestrian can get partway across the street and be in a safe spot to wait before they proceed all the way across the street. It's kind of the aim is to reduce the game of Frogger with pedestrian refuge. Bump outs in the second bullet here, you can see this yellow bumped out area of the sidewalk at intersections. We'll talk about more details on them later, but that's what a bump out is. Bike facilities does not have an arrow because it's a category. A facility in kind of the transportation industry means something that is provided for a particular mode. So like a bike lane would be a type of bike facility. It's not, don't think building, but think maybe an area on the roadway or an area next to the roadway. So that would be what a bike facility is. Protected bike lane is a type of bike facility. And in this case, it's kind of shown up here as one particular type of protected bike lane. Protected bike lanes have vertical protection meaning vertical separation and horizontal separation away from traveling vehicles. And buffered bike lanes just have the horizontal separation, usually by striping. So that's the end of the quick terminology intro. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark for the project background.
All right, thank you, Alicia. So once again, my name is Mark Ambrosi. I'm a senior transportation planner with Broomfield, and I'm project manager for Broomfield for the Midway Boulevard Multimodal Plan. So we're going to start off with some project background. So next slide, please. So we're going to begin kind of going all the way back to the roots of what drives our transportation planning for planning staff in Broomfield, and that's the 2016 transportation plan. And this document was developed with input from the public. Many of the policies reflect what we heard from the public. So this is a guiding document that was really built by the people who live here, not just transportation staff or consultants. So a few things that I want to touch on, and one that Alicia has already talked about a little bit. The first focus of the multimodal plan, and this was a big transition from pre-2016, was a focus on multimodal transportation. And so we just talked about what that is. That's planning for pedestrians, bicyclists, transit, and personal automobiles as well. The second big focus that I want to talk about is planning for people of all ages and abilities. And so this plan establishes policies that ensure a safe, functional transportation system that works for all users. This could be children, older adults, people with mobility challenges, and really everybody. So we're really looking to plan for everybody, not just people in their motor vehicles. The third big point I want to talk about is reducing the dependence on single occupancy vehicles. And so that does not mean we are trying to make it so nobody drives. What we are trying to do is provide transportation choices for people who live in the community. So more options, allowing people to get around the community in the way that they prefer. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about this document. This is the 2019 Bicycle and Pedestrian Assessment. Again, this document was created with input from community members, really driven by the community. And so the big themes here were safety and connectivity. Obviously, we were looking at bicycles and pedestrians in this plan, and Midway Boulevard really popped to the top of the list. So there were a few things that I want to highlight here. It was one of the highest priority low stress networks. So today, Midway Boulevard is not a low stress network for much of it. It's difficult as a pedestrian or bicyclist in certain areas of the corridor. But the goal is, or what this says is the community would like it to be a low stress network, making it easier to bike and walk. It was the third highest corridor in the community for public comments. And this was only behind Sheps Crossing and Industrial Lane. So these were the other, two important corridors to people, but Midway was a close third. It was a very high priority corridor for bicycling, and it was a corridor that was identified by the public in need of improved sidewalk facilities. So this plan really helped drive why we pursued this study that we're talking about tonight. Next slide, please. So what are we looking at with the Midway Boulevard multimodal plan? So we are looking at the entire corridor in Broomfield. This is on the west side at the cul-de-sac with the trailhead to the Lakeland Trail, all the way east, actually past the Broomfield boundary to the Dry Creek Trailhead connection. So we want people to be able to get to that, and then everything in between. And so one thing I want to point out about this slide are all the community facilities that are near or on the corridor. And so this includes things like schools, municipal facilities like the library, the DMV, recreational centers, places of worship, and key support facilities like fish and health and human services. Next slide, please. So why are we doing this? We're really doing this because we need your help making this corridor safer and more equitable for everyone. And so we really want this to be a great community corridor. The residents of Broomfield have said that they want this to be a good corridor, a low stress corridor. And your voice is really essential in developing this study so that we get a corridor that's going to work great for the people that live here and use Midway Boulevard. Next slide, please. So schedule, what are we talking about for the timeline for this project? First thing I want to point out is the big public engagement circle. Public engagement is a part of every phase of this project, and it's going to be a part of implementation of the projects that come out of this study. So we will be coming back to you for more feedback as the project continues. So basically this project started in the spring of 2021. We developed a strategy for the project and how we were going to tackle this study. Kind of the spring and through right around now, we've been doing data collection and analysis. So grabbing existing conditions. We also set up the website at broomfieldvoice.com/Midway plan, where you can engage with the project. So we've been collecting public feedback in this phase. Kind of moving into the fall and winter, we will be taking this information and developing alternative designs and concepts for the corridor. Following that, we'll be setting up a second round of public meetings to get your feedback about these alternative designs and your preferences for how the corridor should look. Moving along into the winter, we will be taking that information, the alternatives, narrowing them down and creating a corridor concept for the extent of Midway. We are going to be prioritizing individual projects in the corridor and doing cost estimates for construction costs. So we have an idea of what are we getting ourselves into for these individual projects. Once again, we will be coming back to the community to share this recommendation with you and get your feedback about whether we got it right or wrong or it needs to be changed. Now in the spring, winter into the spring, we will get a final plan with recommendations. And then hopefully, from the spring moving into the summer, we'll start implementation of small projects. And then as we move into the future, we'll be taking on bigger projects like big intersection projects and other things to make more transformation of Midway. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk a little bit about the existing conditions that we've identified so far. So next slide. So what this slide is showing us are basically the existing corridor characteristics. And so what the arrows are the lanes or basically the lane configurations in different sections of the corridor. So some areas you have one lane in each direction, others two. The stoplights are pretty self-explanatory. They're stoplights, signalized intersections. The dots and the kind of star looking things, those are crosswalks and enhanced crosswalks. So maybe they have a flashing beacon on them or a push button to tell cars that you're crossing the street. And at the bottom, we have the existing speed limits on the corridor. Next slide, please. What we're showing here is average daily vehicle traffic that we collected from the past few years. So this is probably a 3-year average. You'll notice the corridor overall has some pretty significant levels of traffic. There are some lower levels of traffic west of US 287, kind of moderate levels of traffic between Main Street and Sheridan. And then everywhere else, you're around 17,000 vehicles per day. So pretty high levels of traffic. Next slide, please. So this slide is a little bit more complex. I want to spend a minute on it and talk it through. So I'm going to begin with the top half of the slide, the eastbound trips. What this is showing are the number of, or the percentage of vehicles traveling from a specific intersection, so 287, where the mouse is hovering now, all the way through to Zuma. So these are the vehicles that started at 287, went all the way through to Zuma. So what this means is that 90% of vehicles starting at US 287 are not traveling the entire length of the corridor. Similarly, if you look at the westbound trips, we have a similar distribution where most trips starting at Zunai do not go all the way to US 287. About 90% of them are going somewhere along the corridor. Next slide, please. So what's that tell us? What we think it tells us is that the traffic on Midway does not, in large part, represent through traffic or regional trips. So it's not people coming from Thornton necessarily. It's not people coming from Lafayette. This is people living in the corridor or along the corridor. People are traveling within the corridor to get to their destination, whether it's their home or their job or something like that. I think that's a really important point when we're thinking about the improvements on this corridor and how we want it to change. Next slide, please. Here we're showing some of the crash history on the corridor. This is a 5-year crash history for vehicles and a 7-year crash history for bicycles and pedestrians. Kind of going back to that 2019 bicycle and pedestrian assessment, that assessment showed us that 20% of all pedestrian and bicycle crashes in Broomfield take place on Midway Boulevard. That's a big number. And so that's one of the reasons we have a real eye toward making improvements for bicycles and pedestrians on this corridor to make it safer, make it easier to cross the street and ride along the street. There are also pretty high levels of vehicular crashes, as you notice. Most of them take place at some of the major intersections. Then we have some jumps kind of between the intersections. So between US 287 and Main Street, maybe that's near some of the schools, and you might get some of that school traffic and some rear end crashes there. Next slide, please. So I think this is the last one I'm going to be talking about for existing conditions. I want to talk a little bit about speed data. So we collected average traffic speeds along the corridor, and this will come as no surprise to anybody, but people go faster than the speed limit. On the eastern side of the corridor over by Lowell and Zunai, people are traveling around 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. And I think that's an experience that we can all kind of recognize in our own traveling on the corridor. As you move further west, kind of between Main Street and Sheridan, there's not quite so much speeding, although in the middle of the corridor, you get some higher speeds. And then west of Main Street, the speeds are a little bit lower, and that's probably because of some congestion on the street. So it's keeping people traveling at a lower speed. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Alicia to bring us through the rest of the existing conditions.
Thank you, Mark. So for just a few minutes, I'm going to talk about what that data means. Now, we've got a bunch of data, and we've got even more, but we don't want to drag you all through it. Those are the main points. So one of the first things we think about that data, especially that last slide that Mark presented with speed, is that we want to know what that means for how we could potentially improve this. One of the considerations for a bicycle user, somebody who is a person who's riding a bicycle, and the reason some of these may focus a little bit on those is because the world has changed a little bit more, or I should say the US has changed a little bit more for bicycle infrastructure and those riding bicycles than it has vehicles, those driving in cars and those on foot. It is not at all to say that we're ignoring those other two modes, but some of the new guidance, this for example, is focused on those riding bicycles. So for this one specifically, Broomfield uses national and local guidelines and standards. And this is an FHWA document graph. FHWA is Federal Highway Administration. So it's a federal graph document that has come out recently. And it's a speed versus volume chart. And it tells you what the best bicycle facility type for a particular road, given a number of vehicles per day on the road and a speed. And we've charted the speeds that we have on Midway. And basically we have, and this is even looking at the speed limits, and the speed, the actual 85th percentile speed is a little bit higher on a number of these, as Mark mentioned. So 2 locations to the west of 287 are on this chart down closer to the bike lane buffer per vert, especially the furthest west that we measured. But everything else, all the other measurements that we have are basically off the chart. Now the dark blue extends as high as you can make it go. So they're well into the separated bike lane or shared use path treatment recommendations. And a question is, what is a shared bike lane or separated bike lane or shared use path? So I've put some photos over on the right, and I'll go through those really quickly. We'll talk about the merits of them later. A separated or protected, some communities call it bike lane. These are 2 ways that those can look. It's certainly not the only looks, but basically, like I said, it provides that vertical separation in addition to horizontal separation. Buffered bike lanes provide just the horizontal separation, and that's this light blue color over here on the graph. And typical bike lanes are conventional, are the same without that extra stripe. And then a shared lane or bike boulevard is more what this people call them sharrows or shared lane markings, saying a bicycle, you may encounter somebody on a bicycle here. We obviously on Midway, there is a shared bike lane. There is a sharrow marking out there now, and none of the speeds or volumes generally would match that on this table. And again, a little additional background on recent bicycle kind of theory for design here is a study that was originally done a little while ago by a guy named Roger Geller, and he categorized the general population into what type of bicyclists they may be. And he did this study a little while ago, and it was recently another statistically valid survey study was done in the Denver metro area, and it was confirmed actually almost the exact same numbers, which is quite impressive to see. So just for those in case you're on the phone, this shows the highly confident bicyclists are 4% of the population. Somewhat confident people on bikes are 12%, and the interested but concerned, and you'll hear me mention interested but concerned again, is 59%. And then there's a portion of the population, 25%, who are, we say, no way, no how. They're not going to ride a bicycle. They're just not interested, which is also totally fine because we'll be addressing those with this corridor project as well. So they will at some point in their trip be a pedestrian. What does this kind of split out mean is that 16% of people only regularly feel comfortable bicycling today. But the biggest thing is 59, let's say 60% of people would like to bicycle, but only if it were safer and more comfortable. So that is a population that we're definitely going to keep in the back of our mind as we develop some of these facility recommendations, in addition to the users that are currently out there on foot, on wheels, and in passenger vehicles. I want to do a quick summary of community feedback to date to kind of round out our existing conditions. We've already been doing some kind of pre-outreach events. This is a picture of Mark here doing a pop-up event, one of 2 we've done so far. This one is National Night Out, and we also did Broomfield Days just over the weekend. It was a hot one, but we've got some great input there. A lot of people stopped by, which was great. And we have these 3 online workshops this week. We are doing questions of the week on the Broomfield Voice and social media. And so keep an eye out for those because they're going to be changing. It's not just a static, we ask one question and leave it. And so far, as of the end of August, we have 177 online map-based comments. Those are online, not even including the little dots in this picture from the in-person events. We've also done direct mail postcards in English and Spanish, and we're doing social media comments. That's basically how many people does social media touch. So we are, through many methods, trying to connect with people. So hopefully you have heard of this. Obviously you made it here. To summarize the actual comments we've gotten so far, we have 252, excuse me, we have 252 comments as of the end of August, online and in person, and 64% of those are safety related as we've cataloged them. And you can see the source here. And we don't this is a snapshot. So at any point in the project, we keep an eye on this, we continue to monitor, we read every comment, but we don't ever base the future, ideas and plans on solely one snapshot. So this is a live thing, we'll keep updating. But this snapshot as of the end of August shows the top two concerns by far are crossing concerns and intersection concerns, as well as concerns with bike facilities or lack thereof. And then we kind of get down into some of the middle ones with traffic and crash concerns and bike lane discomfort. So that just gives you a feeling of how we're cataloging these. We also have them broken out in many other kind of types of ways to slice the data, but just a quick update for now. So I see that there are a few other questions. We're almost to our second Q&A session, but first I want to do a polling session with 2 questions about the data existing conditions information that we've presented so far. So I am going to launch this poll if I can figure out. I might need a little help from the IT folks because I'm just seeing the old poll question. Here we go. Got it. Poll questions 2 and 3. Launch. All right. So really quickly, this is 2 different questions shown simultaneously for a reason. The first question asks if the data we've shown matches your experience. That's easy. You guys all use the corridor, and does the data we show about speed and volume and everything match about what it feels like to you? Second question is more nuanced. It is whether or not that data matches your experience. Do you accept it as being accurate? Can you believe it's right? And, unless there was some big miss, yeah, that's the existing conditions, let's go. So go ahead, I'll give you a minute to answer those questions. All right. We've got over half of you have answered. Let's get a few more. Keep going, folks. If I had candy, I would start tossing it to the people who answered most quickly. But I have little kids, so maybe the motivation in my house is a little different than out there tonight. Okay, we'll do 15 more seconds. Five more seconds. All right, we're going to hit end poll here, and I'm going to share the results. So hopefully all of you can see so far what we have here. Does this data match your experience? And the majority say yes, and some of you say maybe some of it matches, which is not surprising because, for instance, I spoke to somebody at Broomfield Days who says, drive it all the time, twice a day at 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. And so, those are hours that you may not be seeing the whole spectrum. Or on the other side, if you see it only when it's the busiest, you may not be seeing the rest of the hours of the day. And then there's one person who said, no, it doesn't reflect their experience at all. So we'll get into hearing your questions on that soon. That would be great. And then the second question on whether you accept the data as being accurate. Again, the majority, it's basically the same split. The majority say, yes, I accept it. And we do have 2 people saying, no, I don't agree with any of it. So I would love if, now we can pull up the chat, which is different from the Q&A. If you put it in the Q&A, we'll sort it. But if you can pull up the chat, and for those folks who don't agree with it or think it's accurate, let us know if there's one particular area, one of the speed or the volume or something like that, that you feel like isn't accurate. That would be great. Okay, so we'll keep an eye on that chat, and feel free to enter that in the chat for what you feel like is not accurate. We're going to keep moving here. Okay, so we're at our second Q&A before we get into kind of the good stuff of the ideas. Right now, I've been seeing a number of questions come in, and Sarah's been answering some of those in the chat. So I think we'll do a quick summary here. And then Mark, I may throw a few of these your way as well, and we can have about, looks like we have about 5 minutes to answer questions for now. So one question which Sarah already answered, so I can just repeat it here since Sarah, the brains behind this effort has already put it in there. How does the daily average, JH says, how does the daily average car traffic on Midway compare to 120th? And she says, for example, 120th Avenue, east of Sheridan. So east of Sheridan is 47,000 vehicles per day, roughly. So while Mark said this corridor has a lot of traffic, and it does feel like that, there's certainly pieces of it that do. Excuse me, it is roughly a quarter. Am I doing that math right? Yeah, it's less than a quarter of what, no, roughly less than half. So maybe a third of what is on 120th Avenue. But I think one of the reasons that question was asked was about what people riding bicycles are doing on 120th. Another question was from JH again, what other streets in Broomfield would match to a separated protected bike lane? And that's according to that FHWA chart. And basically, Sarah mentions that anything over 7,000 vehicles per day, they blur that line on purpose because there's certainly some exceptions in both directions. And anything over 35 miles an hour, the type of bicycle facility FHWA recommends would be protected or separated. And we have one more. Shato says, are you planning additional in-person outreach events? We had those 2 booths. We had the National Night Out and Broomfield Days last Saturday. We are thinking through other in-person opportunities, trying to keep an eye on, of course, those county guidelines for COVID. But we are considering whether we can get out and talk to people in person, especially in smaller groups in the next phase, which is the alternatives phase. So we will announce those opportunities if we're able to do them on the Broomfield Voice website. And then there's one more question. Actually, it looks like it's in response to that last poll. Oh, and I see, Mark, jump in, interrupt me. I see you got your hand.
Just about the additional in-person outreach events, we're going to certainly be investigating opportunities for these upcoming phases, but I would just like to mention we do have, or we have planned and that we have budget for targeted outreach events. So if there are suggestions about maybe groups that are harder to reach, groups with a specific interest about this corridor, we may be able to put something together. I think that any suggestions that you can include in chat about groups that are important for us to be having conversations with, we would love to hear about those. So I encourage you to add your suggestions to chat. And I'm not making any promises about specific groups, but I will say if there are some that we feel like have been underrepresented, we would love to talk with them. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, feel free to interrupt me, Mark, you know, when I get going. One other, Chateau did respond about whether the existing conditions we presented were accurate. And the comment was that Chateau doesn't feel that the speed numbers you have are accurate. Are accurate because the Main to 287 vehicles are traveling a lot faster than the speed limit of 30 miles an hour. So thank you for that perspective. And we will continue to monitor this. We have in the plans basically additional budget to look back at some existing conditions. Once we have come up with some ideas to basically confirm some of those. So that may be an area we go back and look at. And I'm going to pull the speed slide up again here real quick. And so this is 287 to Main. So Chateau felt like probably higher than 34 and 32. And somebody else, go ahead.
I think with this section, those 85th percentile speeds are probably dragged down a little bit because of congestion in the morning and congestion in the afternoon. So like school drop off where you have cars basically standing still will really reduce that average speed. So it may be at other times of the day, those speeds are much higher than we're seeing in this slide. So this is an average over the whole day, and that may not be representative of, you know, specific time periods throughout the day.
And I would add also that we look into more than just the 85th percentile. We look to see if there's another bump in the tail of above 85th percentile. If there's a significant group of people doing, you know, I'm just picking a number, 40 miles an hour here or 45, then we know that there's probably a speed concern when the congestion is not around. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that. So, and then, yes, and then the note about eliminating stop traffic. So we will continue to look into that. So there's also one in the chat about bike lanes being separated from street parking. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the ideas in the next section. So I think we'll hold on that. And then I see one more coming in and we'll move on, but I need to take a quick look at this one. So. Okay, so this is Lynette. Thank you for your perspective on on letting us know that you feel like the speed numbers are also not accurate. So it sounds like speed is the main one that people are feeling like is not representative, and that there are people that their voice or their perspective and their needs, particularly those living on Midway, haven't been heard. So thank you for. Hopefully you're one of them and bring back your neighbors as well, because we absolutely want to hear from you. So, okay. So I think, Sarah, if we're good to go, I think we're going to move on into the next section. All right.
I just had one more question. It was put in the chat from Alan. He asks, can bike lanes be separated from the street parking on Midway?
Okay. And I think that categorizes or qualifies as an idea, Alan. I'm assuming you're thinking of what we might be able to do, which is great. So let's hold that one until the end so that we can see if I don't think we'll answer your question, but you can tell us whether we covered I thought, as one of the ideas presented. All right, now I got to get us back to the right slide here. Okay, all right, I'm going to hand it back over to Mark for intro to our toolbox and ideas.
All right, thanks, Alicia, and great discussion there during the Q&A session. So we are now digging into the toolbox and ideas for making improvements. I'm going to outline kind of how we're thinking about the corridor before turning it back over to Alicia to talk about some specific ideas. All right, next slide. So to start, the way we are thinking about the corridor are character areas. And so what these are we have grouped segments of the corridor into self-similar sections to the best of our ability. We tried not to get too many, but we wanted enough to capture kind of the diversity of the corridor. And so as you can see on this screen, we have some pictures at the bottom showing different segments of the corridor that are all a little different. And the map at the top kind of splits up the segments as we are looking at them when we're exploring solutions to issues that we find on the corridor. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start all the way at the west. This was that yellow bubble on the last map. This is that section, the Lake Link Trail to US 287. This section I'd say is pretty straightforward. It's the lowest traffic section. There is the most heavy truck traffic. The land use adjacent to this area of Midway is largely industrial. There's a lot of pavement. As you can see here, there's wide lanes. There are 0 bike lanes. Sidewalks are narrow and attached to the roadway. And this is kind of the section that's probably least inviting when you're taking a walk after dinner or something, of that nature. So this is a section that we have a lot of opportunity to make changes because we have a lot of space. And we would like to see this become a little more inviting and attractive for all users and not just those heavy trucks. Next slide, please. So the next section I'm going to talk about is US 287 to Main Street. And this is really broken up into two kind of character areas. This section kind of overall has the highest traffic volume, the most crashes, the lanes that kind of shift from 1 to 2, and then you get a turn lane, and it's a little bit confusing out there. It's pretty narrow actually, curb to curb, so there's not quite as much space to paint in bike lanes or make those types of changes without really changing the roadway. The bike lanes, because of that, are pretty inconsistent throughout this stretch of the corridor. And it's really characterized by kind of a commercial area on that western side, kind of US 287 to Midway Park. And then Midway Park, as you move over to Main Street, it's more residential, but it does still have a lot of different kind of road segments. There's some center turn lanes, and there are still some challenges out there. Next section, please. Well, I guess this is kind of that Cole Street to Main Street area. As you can see, it's less commercial. There is a lot of traffic out in this section. There's a lot of school traffic. And this image actually on the bottom here, it shows a shared street for the bicycles. So you have the bike marking on the street. That's a shared space. And so it's less comfortable for bicyclists in this area. You also have somewhat narrow sidewalks in this section, but they aren't attached to the road. So you do have a little bit of a buffer to make folks feel more comfortable despite the high traffic volumes. All right, yeah, and then Alicia's pointing to the school traffic, I think, at the top here, where you can see some of the issues that and the challenges, I think, on this section of corridors. How do we accommodate people trying to drop their kids off, people trying to drive to work, people wanting to bike, walk on the sidewalk? There are a lot of different challenges in this area, and so it's going to be, I think, one of the sections we're going to have to get more creative, and the more input we can have from you out there, the better with this section. All right, next slide. So the next strip is Main Street to Sheridan. This is actually a newer portion of Midway Boulevard. This did not exist, I want to say 30 years ago. we spoke with some folks at Broomfield Days, and they remember when this road was not here. So this is a newer area, and it's a lot different than everything to the west. So this is kind of characterized as a single lane in each direction, quite a bit of pavement to actually make changes within each of those kind of directional lanes. There is a landscaped median out there with mature trees. And so through this section, if you're driving, you can feel a little bit isolated. You might not be expecting a pedestrian to jump out from the median or from the side of the road. It feels a lot different than some of the other areas of the corridor. And so we did see some higher traffic volumes kind of through the middle of this area. And again, I think it feels more comfortable in the vehicle, and we have some real opportunities through this section to make it better for pedestrians and bicyclists as well. Next slide, please. So this last section is Sheridan all the way east to Zuma. So this is half the corridor or around that amount. This section is different. It's defined by having 2 travel lanes. As you can see, it looks like a highway out here. We see higher speeds through this area. There is still a median with mature trees through much of this area of the corridor. The land uses adjacent to these areas are open space and residential primarily. So it's being used a little bit differently. It looks a little bit different. In the space where the vehicles travel, there is less space to make changes for bicyclists. And to be quite honest, it does not feel comfortable as a bicyclist riding next to 2 lanes of traffic. Again, the speeds are pretty high, the traffic volumes are pretty high, and this is an area really, it would be nice to provide a higher level of protection for bicyclists and potentially better pedestrian facilities through this area as well. Next slide, please. All right, well, I'm going to turn it back over to Alicia to bring us home here with this presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. So given that kind of framework of how we're looking at this, we're still looking at each specific location differently. But as a project team, we kind of thought through some of the ideas that might apply depending on which segment, as Mark talked about, you're in. And this is just a collage here, but it's here to tell you that these facilities or the ideas that we're going to talk about in our toolbox exist all around. Even if it's something that Broomfield hasn't seen before, they certainly exist in other locations, and they're working in other locations. And also to point out that the Broomfield Bike PED assessment, bicycle and pedestrian assessment that Mark talked about earlier, actually has a basic toolbox in it to start with. So these have been presented and discussed with Broomfield residents and Broomfield staff previously. So this isn't new stuff, although some of it is a little more, a little bit beyond that, what has been discussed before. There are also guidelines applied throughout the country, regionally and locally, that are out here as well. NACTO is an organization some of you may have heard of that is looking at more urban streets because so many of the federal and state guidelines are more considering highways. And so, NACTO has put together a few, and we also have a regional one for the Denver region. I'm going to go through some ideas. They're kind of separated into intersections, and we'll talk about the intersections first. As I'm going through the ideas, think about, could this be right for Midway? Could this be right for a portion of Midway? Is this just totally wrong? Does it not go far enough? And I give a range, so be patient if it doesn't go far enough. And think of those things, because we'll have an opportunity for that feedback in the last polling and Q&A. So ideas for intersections. One of the basic ones, you all have some around here in Broomfield, is a bump out. Now, I pointed to a picture with a bump out before, or a graphic, but I want to tell you what bump outs can do. So bump out is this area here where Sometimes there's parking here, where the curb can kind of come out behind the parking, and it often does it on both corners. And the things that the bump out does, it can help first reduce the distance that a pedestrian crossing has to walk across. So you feel less exposed, and you are exposed for a smaller amount of time, which can help actually with delay at some intersections, because you don't have to have the signal say, yes, green to pedestrians as long. It also helps reduce turning speed, and even can help reduce through speed. So a vehicle traveling, a person in a car traveling through here has increased what we call side friction, particularly if there isn't parking along here. Side friction is basically just friction you feel, almost like a discomfort you feel along the side, which actually helps slow traffic. So it can help through vehicle speeds. It can help turning vehicle speeds, because usually the radii, the curb corner, the round part, sticks out a little bit more. Well, shouldn't say it sticks out, but the radius is different. And so you might have to take the turn at 5 or 10 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour instead of 15, which helps you see the person crossing another road easier. So can help with speed mitigation, helps reduce the crossing distance. This one is a little different one. It's kind of a funky implementation version, but what it's here to show you is just that bump outs can look very different. They can be with temporary material, they can be with permanent material, they can be with more visually impactful material. The previous picture I showed, what I failed to say, it can also provide additional space for landscaping or art, or kind of what they call placemaking, making something really a place. And this version is a little bit more temporary, and it also allows trucks to turn over it. So there are some nuances there in designing to make sure everybody can get around the corner that needs to. This is just a version of a permanent bump out with improved crosswalks. So this maybe looks a little bit more familiar and just gives you kind of a gut feeling of what it would really look like in real life. Now, this picture is actually from an urban suburban intersection in Fort Collins on College and Horsetooth. And Horsetooth had to have these multi-use paths because of the volumes and speeds on Horsetooth, and people who are wanting to ride bicycles for their transportation. And one of the things you can do for either a sidewalk or a multi-use path to help with safety at an intersection is to set it back a little bit. If you imagine somebody coming along here and turning, it's set back far enough where you get your car almost turned to where you're facing that pedestrian who's crossing in front of you, instead of the pedestrian coming up right alongside you. So the goal here is to reduce the turning speed and improve visibility of those pedestrians, or in this case, bicyclists who are walking across. Another way of reducing turning speed and improving visibility, and in this case, improving compliance as well, is this triangle island where the pedestrian waits, we call Pork Chop Island, which always makes me laugh. So this pedestrian walkway crossing between the sidewalk and the Pork Chop Island is raised. You see this, it kind of starts here and it goes up. It's marked differently and it's raised. And raising that crossing, like I said, slows down those turners, especially in conditions where it's a yield and it was kind of originally designed to be able to go fast or accommodate very large vehicles. It also has in applications, you may have seen it in Boulder before, it's certainly done other places along the Front Range. It has better compliance, which means more cars stop for pedestrians crossing there. You, I'm sure, have all had the experience as a pedestrian kind of waiting for the cars to stop and you go, oh, can I go now or do I have to wait? And in this case, it would be more likely that you would be able to go when you arrived at the intersection. Excuse me. This one shows, you see this two-way crossing, bright yellow sign. The reason I'm showing this one is because we don't want to forget the kind of in-between treatments. In this case, it's showing a driveway, which is basically a small intersection. A driveway can be just as dangerous because you have, unanticipated conflicting traffic from those driving cars and those riding bikes and those walking. So we will certainly be considering ideas for driveways as well. And this particular idea is increased signage and increased pavement marking. One other piece in our intersection toolbox is markings, paint on the ground. Some people call them ground plane markings. This particular idea, Broomfield doesn't have any, but they are being implemented in throughout the Front Range. Is called a two-stage turn queue box. It's kind of a mouthful, two-stage turn queue box. But what it does is it allows somebody who's riding a bicycle on the right side of the road to not have to move into traffic to the left turn lane in order to turn left to a different bicycle facility to get to their destination. Basically, it helps separate them from traffic, or at least give them the opportunity to separate themselves if that's more comfortable. So this person on a bike would be coming at us here and would come and stop on this little green spot when the light is, when their light is green. Then they wait until this light, which is currently yellow in the picture, turns green, and then they can go straight across on the right side of the road. So there are many ideas like this that are in some of the new guidelines that we'll be considering as well. Okay, if you all are still with me, we're gonna talk through pedestrian facilities and then one other section next. So you all have some, Mark talked about some of those wider, a few almost as wide as you would consider a multi-use path on the side of some sections. Some sections have narrower sidewalks. And so the first thing we're just going to look at is, are the sidewalk connectivity and widths sufficient for making a comfortable pedestrian environment? And if they aren't sufficient, or for instance, if we need to widen it to actually become a multi-use path, there are some gentler ways that we consider widening. Certainly where we have room and where we're able to expand those locations with concrete, that's the easiest to maintain and the easiest to use. But there are some more park-like ways of expanding those, and a little bit reduces the impervious area. And these two examples are showing soft surface parallel trails as well. So just one idea. Now this is in a heavier volume area. This is, we're having a technical debate on whether this is considered a shared use, or a multi-use path, or a protected or separated bike lane, two ways, and sidewalk. And it doesn't matter what you call it. What it enables is bicyclists to travel in both directions on one side of the road, separated from the road, and pedestrians to have their own space. So like I said, this was in a location with a lot of bikes and a lot of pedestrians, and it helps a lot to have that separation in those conditions. In this case, it has separate visual materials to help separate that as well. So there are a few different ways to do that. Also, mid-block, this is actually a mid-block pedestrian crossing. And there are two things I want to point out here. First off, the pedestrian refuge island you can see just past this car. This person was able to cross partway before they crossed the rest of the way, and it allowed them to wait in the middle. This person crossing also has additional enhanced signing and what we call an RRFB, rectangular rapid flashing beacon. Excuse me. The RRFB and other, mid-block treatments and lights, flashing things, have different installation criteria depending on roadway type, volume, number of pedestrians. But what I want to say, because people are asking about these RRFBs and you all have some, an RRFB is the highest type of crossing treatment that is still unprotected, because this is still basically a voluntary yield, meaning drivers must voluntarily yield, whereas, you know, the next level up is some type of signal where it has a red circular ball that says you can't go through here. So consideration of what level of treatment is correct at what location based on number of lanes, speed, volume of people driving cars, volume of people walking and biking will be important. A very similar one here, and you can see the refuge island a little bit better, but with a different RFB signage configuration. And also note, these are installed where there are 2 lanes each direction. And some, you know, there's a lot of nuance on what is most comfortable and safest for people depending on laneage as well. This last one, which you say another pedestrian refuge island, why are we showing this? This one's a little bit different in that it actually goes through the whole intersection. So it reduces the conflict points at the intersection by removing some of the conflicting movements. So if this were a 2-way left turn lane previously, it removes those left turns to can help reduce crashes, help reduce you know, confusion and potential conflict points. It can also provide space for a pedestrian refuge island where there wasn't previously space. You all are certainly familiar further to the east where there are these beautiful landscape boulevards and a left turn lane and a tiny little nose with not median nose, that little kind of rounded end of the median with not quite enough space to have somebody stop there. So that is this is an opportunity to help add space by reducing the number of movements at an intersection. And this one is a pedestrian refuge island, a pretty narrow one, at a location just showing that it doesn't just serve pedestrians. Those interested but concerned people on bikes also can use it. And you can see that kind of depends on how big you make it, on how comfortable it is. This kid's bike fits, but the adult bike is maybe not barely going to fit in there. So let's see. This slide just shows you can do some of these treatments in a temporary or fast action, quick implementation method as well, with you know, posts and marking signage, paint on the ground, and in this case, some additional brightly colored signage as well, which is you know, per guidelines. I want to make sure too that you don't just think of this from what can we put on the ground or what physical change can we make. We are certainly considering what we call operational changes. Outside of infrastructure changes, operational changes can change the number of seconds that each direction of travel can, you know, vehicles get to go, number of seconds you get on green if you're in a car, or the, you know, man hand is what we call the white walking person when you're a pedestrian. And this example, just the diagrammatic example, is what we call a leading pedestrian interval, LPI. And all it means is that pedestrians get to start going. Like all the signals are red, all directions for vehicles, and pedestrians get to start going until they're partway in the road before that kind of parallel traffic that might have that conflicting right turn goes. So these pedestrians get to go just a little bit so that they can establish themselves in that crosswalk before a vehicle traveling this way gets a green light and could potentially turn right across them. So it reduces the cartoon start, both vehicles or both starting at the same time challenges. Okay, bicycle facilities, and then we're going to have a break here because we're at 8:14, and like I said, I want to make sure I get you out. We've seen some of these pictures already through some of the other sections, and that's kind of an important part, is that all of these systems work together. You see a refuge island in the making here. This is a buffered bike lane, and it also has some green paint. And right now, most communities are using that green paint as marking conflict zones, which means a location where somebody driving may anticipate intercepting somebody or seeing somebody who is on a bike, or somebody who's biking may say, hey, this is where a vehicle may cross. The other thing you see here is actually conflict marking for a bus stop. So you can actually make these bus stops and the bike facilities get along as well. One other thing I wanted to point out here is just that bicycle facilities being added to a roadway can help pedestrians as well and help motorists. Because if you're having these interactions, cleaning up that kind of delineation, cleaning up the separation can help people who are driving cars know when to expect a bicyclist. And it can actually add separation for somebody who's walking on the sidewalk. They might have been walking pretty close to, a 40 miles an hour car, but adding in this bike facility means that they get additional separation from the moving motor vehicles. Moving one step from the buffered bike lanes, the protected or separated bike lanes that we mentioned when we were looking at the FHWA chart, excuse me, just adds some vertical element in that buffer. Here it's a little harder to see straight on, but you can see these are called flexible posts or bollards, or many different names for them. A little easier to see on the far side of the road here. And they just give cars a little bit more, reason to shy away, and they give people riding bicycles a little bit more comfort. And one I want to point out there is that the more people you get to ride the bicycles, the more predictable it is for both people driving cars and riding bikes, because you have more bikes out there. The person driving the car learns to expect a bicycle there. It's not just that random bicyclist every once in a while. So this is one type of protected or separated bike lane. This is the second type. Excuse me. This is the second type of protected bike lane, and it's a raised one. Some people find this a little bit more comfortable, has different, maintenance needs and different construction costs, but it's still separated from the sidewalk over here as its own bicycle facility, and it's separated from the traveled way as well. I'm showing a little bit on costs here to close this out. And this is not at all to say that costs are the main thing we're going to consider, or that costs are the main thing anybody should consider. But it's also to recognize that this is real money. This is your taxes. And that's why we're flagging it. It's, like I said, it's not the only thing, but we'd be remiss if we didn't mention it. I have this comfort and safety. It's not 100% proportional, but comfort and safety is kind of increased as we go down the table here. And just saying that, and bike facilities specifically, simply restriping is obviously the cheapest to install and maintain. And then getting down to an off-street path or a protected or separated bike lane have different installation and maintenance costs that we need to consider, because, I can't really rightfully say, hey, Broomfield staff, we decided on something that you're never going to be able to implement or maintain. So we're considering that as we move forward. Okay, I got to take a break. We have a polling session and a Q&A, but one of my team members stopped me if we shouldn't move straight into the poll here. All right, okay. I'm going to pop up the poll. This is our last polling session, and we have two questions up on this one as well. And what we're going to ask on these is about the ideas we presented. Basically, are they applicable to Midway? And the second question is, would they make Midway safer, more equitable, and more comfortable? Or do you just not agree with that at all? So on these polling questions, we ask you to share ideas, thoughts in the chat. So feel free, this is the time to do it, say, yeah, that's great, or I hated this one, or I could see this particular idea in this particular segment. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. Okay, should be up. Cool. So I am showing 0 have participated. So I either put you all to sleep or you're all putting your kids to sleep or the poll's not up. Oh, there's somebody. Okay, poll's up. My team says it's up too. And this one takes a little more thought and ideas, so we'll keep it open a little bit longer. I need the Jeopardy theme song here. Who's good at singing? Okay, we've got 8 of 12. And for those 8 of you who have answered, I'm going to give you another minute. If you can, yeah, I'm seeing some comments in the chat. Great. If you can add your, I see bike path, mixed use trail to open space along Midway. So that's perfect. Give us your ideas, what'll work and won't work in particular locations. And I forgot to mention the last question on here until I was looking for it here. What else should we consider as well? So please put your answer in the chat. Okay, 9 of 12. We'll do 15 more seconds, then we'll talk. All right. Okay, 5 seconds. We'll shut it down here. All right. Okay, share results. Hopefully you all can see. I'm going to talk through these really quick and then we'll just move this straight into the Q&A as well, because that's the next one and mostly most of the end of our presentation here too. So the first question about, do you think any of the ideas presented are applicable to Midway? And it looks like 4 out of 9 says yes. And we'll go through what the ones that apply are. And about half say maybe. So no absolute no's, which is hopefully means we covered a lot of them, but some that apply maybe some places, maybe not others. Second question, would any of the ideas presented make Midway Boulevard safer, more equitable, and more comfortable for all users? We had about a third people saying yes and 2/3 saying maybe. So we'll see those results in the chats in a second. Last question, are there other options the team should consider? And maybe and not sure, which is fair, about half and half. So that's why we're here. We just want to make sure that there wasn't something obvious that we missed, and we'll keep our eye out too. So, okay. So going up to the chat then to dig into some of those responses. Yay, we got a lot. Thanks, folks. So LS says bike path, mixed use trail through open space along Midway and flashing lights at more pedestrian crossings. And I think more pedestrian crossings is referring to some of those other, those other locations that currently have the flashing lights, the RRFBs. So good to hear. The LPI, reminder that that's the leading pedestrian interval on Midway and Main is needed for east and westbound ped traffic. So making sure we're considering those operational changes as well. JH says bollards, and more bollards. So JH is interested in protecting bike facilities that are out there. And then, let's see, it's showing as Jones. Most ideas seem like good ideas, but also seems to take space that isn't available. Living on Midway, we don't want the front of our property altered, and we don't want traffic closer to the house. And that's something we hear a lot in the in-person sessions that we've had is, how are you going to fit any changes in? And that's one of the biggest challenges we're looking at. Mark, I saw you unmuted. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think my guess is this person lives between Main Street and 287 somewhere, and it is pretty tight in this area. Broomfield does not want to take and will very, very likely not do anything to anybody's property. That is an absolute last resort. What we may end up doing is looking at that roadway and seeing, do we need all of the space that's now asphalt, and can we maybe change it to serve a different purpose, or can we share it in a different way but not expand the right of way? That's a last resort, and we want to stay away from that with a 10-foot pole. So we know that that's very unpopular. I think other areas of Midway, we have more opportunities to potentially try some of these different ideas out. But yeah, I think it is going to be pretty challenging through US 287 to Main Street.
That's a good point. And Alan, I see, says, I believe that any opportunity might make bike paths wider and separate from traffic would be great. And Alan, I also know you were the one that mentioned before, can we separate the bike lanes and the parking? And there are sections where basically people are using, when there is no parking there, they're using it as a bike lane. And then when there is parking, it's basically wide parking. So you can kind of squeeze a bike in there. So those sections are absolutely something that we're going to look at to see what else can be done to make people a little more comfortable. Last few here, and I want to make sure Mark has 2 minutes to wrap up. Midway Lowell turn lane with triangle pedestrian crossing area, one of those pork chops, good thing to look at. Bump outs for the ped crossing at Midway and Daphne might work. Yep, we've been looking at that location as well. Bump outs near Nativity Church stretch between Main and the park there. Folks loving the LPI idea. And then also talking about taking street space, and reallocating it to some of those other users. Also can change the vehicular speed as well. Roundabouts weren't a big topic tonight, but worth exploring. And actually some other folks were asking about roundabouts as well. So we've heard you there. So, and
we heard that at Broomfield Days from a number of folks promoting that idea, at least.
And I wanted to point out too that if you feel like your suggestion or idea wasn't heard here, we'll talk about 1 or 2 questions and then close it out. Excuse me, the opportunity to provide that input on the online map as well. We're going to put these in the comment database, so they will be cataloged just like any of that. But if you want to, have neighbors come out and share their experience, or you want to reiterate something, feel free to add it in. So I think that's it in the chat. I know we have at least one open question. Somebody asked basically how protected bike lane installation and maintenance costs compared to vehicular lanes. And there's a lot of nuance there, but JH, you have correctly identified that they have different costs for different reasons, right? You do have less asphalt, you have lower vehicle loads because you're talking about cars, you're talking about those on bicycle, not in cars. They do sometimes increase maintenance costs because whereas before you had a plow just plowing the whole road, now you may have a different type of vehicle that needs to maintain it in snow and, to clear it. And then they have additional marking and things like that. So for sure, they're maybe cheaper than a vehicular lane just on a per square foot basis. But because they're narrow, but they also have additional increased costs as well. So, and I think team, I just want to double check to make sure I didn't miss any other questions. Sarah, is there anything I'm missing that we need to address?
I think you got it all, Alicia, as far as the comments and questions that we received in the chat and the Q&A.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to give it back over to Mark. Feel free to answer anything that I missed or should have passed off to you in the first place, and gonna move you on here to next steps as well.
All right, great. No, I think you covered everything really well. Some great questions, great discussion tonight. So try to wrap up quickly here. Next steps, we are going to take this feedback. We do have a number, 2 more meetings this week, so Wednesday and Thursday. Please tell your friends. We'd love to see more people and have additional discussions. We're going to be putting together alternative designs from the information we have gathered so far. We will be coming back to you potentially at some events, so keep your eyes out on the website, but also with some more public meetings coming after we're kind of thought our way through this phase of the project. So to stay involved, you can visit the project website. That is at www.broomfieldvoice.com/Midway plan. Or you can contact us by emailing transportation@broomfield.org. Please include Midway plan in the subject line, just so we know what it's about. Or you can call the Midway plan hotline. That's 303-464-5827. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and please check out the website. We will be back with more information. So yeah, keep checking it out. All right, thank you so much. And I think that's going to wrap us up for the night. So I don't know if the team needs to stay on for just a minute, debrief, or.
Yep, I think, and if anybody else is, if you're interested in hearing it again,